welcome to this week's module. This week we'll be talking in more detail about foster care, the foster care system. We'll start with a quick review of some of the policies that we've already talked about, but we'll focus on those policies that impact foster care specifically. And then we'll talk about issues of safety, permanence, and well-being, and we'll focus on some of these issues that I have listed here on the slide. So beginning with policies, and we've talked about the history of child welfare policies, the Social Security Act, but I want to start our discussion today with the 1961 Fleming Rule. And this statute was significant because it really increased the federal attention to out-of-home placement. And so this was in response to many states that were implementing ADC, Aid to Dependent Children, were denying children cash assistance. So they were denying families assistance if there was an unsuitable home. And so if you remember, that might be that there was a man in the house, that women had children out of wedlock. So there was many different reasons that a home might be deemed unsuitable. And so those children were denied assistance. The Fleming Rule stated that states were no longer allowed to do that. So they were no longer allowed to deny children benefits. They had two options. They could provide services within the home to make it suitable, or they could provide an alternative placement that was suitable. And so many states chose the second option. They chose removing a child from their home and placing them in a suitable placement, in out-of-home placement. And they would receive federal funds to do that. And so that was significant. It really increased the federal support for placing children in out-of-home placement. 1961, so if we're going chronologically, the next significant act that was passed is ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, which we've already discussed in some detail, so I won't go over that again. 1980 was another significant shift if we're looking specifically at foster care. So this was the Adoption Assistance and Child Welfare Act of 1980. The significance of this act is that it created Title 4E of the Social Security Act. So it transferred what is now AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, into its own title of the Social Security Act. And as this transfer occurred, it really increased federal response to out-of-home placement, increased funds, but that also came with increased regulation. So for the first time, the federal government is trying to standardize practices across states, really starting to look at questions of not just safety, but permanence and well-being. And so the federal government, if you're going to get federal funds for 4E for a foster placement, then you must adhere to some of these standards that are being putting in place. So that was significant. Federal regulation increases. We've also talked about this next act, ASFA. This occurred in 1997, and this was significant as well. It really shifted how foster care had been occurring in the United States. One of the significant goals of ASFA was to reduce foster care drift. So what had been happening over the previous decades is that the numbers of children in foster care just exponentially grew. So beginning in the 60s, but all the way up through the 90s, the numbers of children in foster care were growing, but not only that, they were lingering in foster care. So what was meant to be a temporary support where families, so that parents could get back on their feet, was really becoming a permanent kind of, children were just lingering in care. So ASFA was meant to address that. One of the significant things that put in place was timelines. So really looking at timely permanency, not having children stay in foster care for 2, 3, 6 years. And so they put timelines in place that parents had to do what they needed to do to show that they could provide a safe and secure environment within specific timelines. And so that was significant. The other significant piece was that there was more promotion of adoption. So even as parents might be working towards reunification, workers were required to begin a process called concurrent planning. So if Plan A was reunification with parents, that was the permanency goal, then they also had to have a Plan B. Maybe that was a permanent placement with a relative or adoption. So they had to have a Plan B in place that they were also working towards from the very beginning to make permanency more timely. Another significant piece that relates to foster care is MIPA and IEPA, the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act. And we talked about that just a couple modules ago. So again, I'm not going to go into that, but this is where policy stated that you cannot consider race when making placement decisions. So that impacts how you can place children, and if you can try to promote placing children with families of the same race. So that's just a review of some of the policies. So what's happening with foster care placement? So as I mentioned, for many decades, foster care was exponentially growing. But in the last decade, there's been a kind of a gradual decline, not a drastic decline, but a gradual decline. And that's true in New York as well. So here we can see that from 2003 to 2011, there has been a steady gradual decline in the numbers of children in foster care. So that context is happening. What are some of the reasons why? Some of the reasons is because there's been more efforts, again, focusing on family preservation. But this first goal, so if we think about those primary goals that we've been talking about for the past few weeks, the goals of safety, permanence, and well-being, the goal of safety is still primary. But within that goal of safety, there have been these recent policies in place that mandate states to make reasonable efforts to preserve the family. And states, again, have been paying more attention to that and have been able to do that more successfully, been able to keep children safely in their homes. And so that might help account for some of the decrease in out-of-home placement. And how do they decide if children can be maintained safely in their homes? Many states have implemented standardized processes, like New York uses a standardized risk assessment protocol and a safety determination process where they look at safety factors. And if we remember from our earlier discussion, safety is really looking at, is there an immediate concern? Is there an immediate safety issue for the child? And risk is assessing, is there a risk for future issues of safety? And so we've talked about this in previous modules, but of what specific factors are looked at. So I listed those here, but I'm not going to go through them. But that's one way, is using a standardized, really effectively implemented standardized tool to assess risk. So that's one way that workers can make that decision. There have also been recent policies that we've been talking about, like the Fostering Connections Act of 2008, where the federal government has also continued to promote preservation and really also promote this idea of diligent efforts. So instead of just reasonable efforts to preserve family, states must also now use diligent efforts to locate extended family. So even if a child cannot remain with their parent, their biological parent, for a short time or long term, the next step would be to place them, to identify, engage family members that might be able to take that child in. If that doesn't happen, so if they're unable to do that, and we've talked about this in previous modules, so kinship is first. If they're unable to identify relatives are not available or they're not appropriate placements, after all of those things have been done, family preservation, kinship, if none of that is successful, then a child may be placed in foster care. And so there's many steps that workers and agencies have to go through. And there's different types of foster placements. It might be an emergency placement, very short term. There might be pre-placement, so this might be a planned out-of-home placement. So perhaps the child is able to do a pre-placement visit with the foster parent. Ideally, once a child's in need of out-of-home placement, the foster placing agency goes through a matching process, identifies a foster parent, a resource family that would be a good fit, and is a family that can meet the needs of the child. So we'll talk about that a little bit more now. So foster parents are licensed by both public and private agencies. In New York State and Erie County, for example, you may be a licensed foster parent directly with Erie County or through one of the private agencies, local private agencies. So the process is the same for both of those agencies. To become a licensed foster parent, it's a pretty extensive process that lasts several months. You would have to go through a home study, and this includes things like really extensive background checks, not just for you, but any adult who is living in your home, or any adult that regularly might be providing care or might be in the home with the child. So extensive background checks for adults in the home. There would be an extensive interview process to gather information about your background as a potential foster parent, what your goals are, what your current supports are. There's a physical review of your home to make sure that your home is physically appropriate and safe. There's also required pre-service training. So that means before you even become a foster parent, there's pretty extensive training. Two of the most popular curricula that are used are MAP and PRIDE. Locally, I know a lot of agencies use MAP. And this is where you would find out, really make sure that you have a realistic sense of what you're getting into, what to expect from children. There has been quite a bit added around, children looking at issues of grief and loss and trauma, and so what to expect from children's behavior for children who have experienced trauma. They'll walk you through the process of child protection, understanding that there's an expectation that you're working with the birth families, and that you're supporting the birth family and honoring the birth family. So there's pretty extensive training for foster parents. There's also different levels of care for foster care. So you have kinship, so you might be a relative that actually becomes licensed. So it's a kinship foster care placement, that you're a licensed foster care provider for your related child. There's also different levels of treatment foster care, therapeutic, specialized foster care. Different states call these different levels different things, but all of them relate to increased need of the child, and that might be medical needs, emotional behavioral needs, and so there's extra training that foster parents are required to do, but you also get more resources to help you provide for the needs of that specific child. So the level of reimbursement is really based both on the needs of the child as well as the extra time and effort that the foster parent, extra supervision that the foster parent might need to do. Okay, so now we're going to move to focusing again on the children. So some of the issues in foster care, and we'll start with a discussion of placement disruption. So why might I focus on placement disruption first? This is one of the goals, again, safety, permanence, and well-being. This is one of the key indicators that the federal government looks to states. Are you making sure that there's placement stability? So once we've removed a child from the home, have we provided them with some stability? Unfortunately, only about 40% of the states are meeting the federal benchmarks for placement stability. So that means that there is still a lot of disruption in placements, children moving from place to place, from foster home to foster home. Why is this so important? Intuitively, I think we could see why it's important, but there's research now that has looked at this cycle of instability, that with increased disruptions, even for children who had no behavioral problems coming into foster care initially, if they experience multiple disruptions, they're at much greater risk for developing, especially externalizing behaviors, so aggressive behaviors, delinquent behaviors later on. So we want to make sure that we're looking at this, that we're not creating this cycle of instability for children in the foster care system. So what are some risk and protective factors around placement stability? How can we make sure that states, that agencies are doing all that they can to maintain children in one placement? Some of the things are that, research has looked at this quite extensively. Not surprising, one of the biggest reasons that foster parents give for requesting a removal of a child is the behaviors, that they're unable to meet the behavior of the child. So that is probably the number one reason. The age of the child, older children are much more likely to disrupt, and the longer a child stays in foster care, the greater the risk of disruption. Some characteristics specifically around foster parents. Again, you can see a parallel here is that one of the significant pieces of this is not just the child's behavior, but it's the foster parent's inability to address the child's behavior. They don't feel prepared, or in fact are not prepared to address these increasing emotional and behavioral issues that we see in children in foster care today. There's also other reasons. So it might just be the relationship or not a good fit with the child. Maybe that initial matching or placement was not a good fit. Another factor is lack of social support. So the foster parents themselves don't have the support they need to take in a foster child and to meet that child's needs. And then there are just times where there's life changes, divorce, health issues that require a foster parent to request a removal of the child. There's research also that looks at the caseworker characteristics. So if caseworkers have done a really good job spending a lot of time with the foster family, both the youth and the foster parent, has been able to build rapport with the youth and the foster parent, those cases are much more likely to have placement stability. There's research that also looks at there's an increased risk for agencies that have high caseworker turnover. There's increased risk of disruption for those cases as well. So keeping workers in the position so that families aren't changing from one worker to the next really helps this issue as well. There's also some indication that the type of placement may impact stability. Kinship placements are much more likely to have placement stability than, as well as treatment foster care compared to traditional foster homes. The number of children in the foster home, this may also not be surprising, especially in treatment foster care placements. If children have higher level of need, that the fewer the children in the home links to placement stability. So if you have many children in a foster home, and this often happens in agencies, if you have kind of a go-to foster parent that this is the only foster parent that will always take teenage girls, for example. Sometimes those resource families get overutilized, and then you have many children placed in the home that really goes beyond what they can meet. There's also and you may have heard people talking about this, kind of a crisis right now of a lack of permanent foster homes to meet, especially homes that meet the specific needs of the youth. For example, older youth. So there is just a lack of foster homes, and that is a very real issue. So, what can we do to perhaps address some of these things? Targeted recruitment of foster parents, including states that have used current foster parents in recruitment efforts, those that have experience fostering, that can be mentors to new foster parents, even reaching out to their own support system. So reaching out to people to talk about the benefits of foster caring and why folks should do it. States have found some success with that, as well as assessment tools. So really being very careful in that initial matching of a child and a foster parent. Can these foster parents meet the needs of the specific child? This is obviously more difficult when you have fewer foster parents to choose from, that you may make matches that are less than perfect because you have no other choice. So really, these two things I think go hand in hand, as well as making sure that we're retaining foster parents. The research shows that foster parents that have mentoring, peer support, that feel like they're part of a team, that they're really included with the worker, the youth, that those foster parents are much more likely to stay and continue to foster. We also know that foster parents just, really need those informal supports as well as formal support. So family and friends having intentional times, so the agencies really being intentional about bringing foster parents together so they can get support from each other, having respite care, adequate respite care, and adequate compensation for the work that they're doing. Many foster parents dig into their own pockets to pay for extra things for the youth. So really making sure that foster parents are getting what they need is key, very important. Foster parent training. So the pre-service training is critical. So things like MAP and PRIDE are critical. So really making sure that that's helping be realistically showing foster parents what they're getting into. In addition to that, there's many programs that are really instituting ongoing coaching. So once you have a child in your home, having additional trainings, coaching, that you can work with foster parents to help them feel prepared to meet the needs of the child that's right in front of them. So ongoing coaching, supportive training, online training. A lot of states are using different methods to make sure that they're continuing to support foster parents after that initial training period. Okay, so when we're thinking about foster care, so we've talked about some of the issues with the child, making sure the placements are stable. Another piece of foster care, though, is it's temporary. It's often temporary. Over half, the majority of children that enter foster care, their permanency goal is reunification, and over half of them do, in fact, return to their parents. So what are the factors related to the biological parents when we're thinking about foster care? So we're going to one of the key issues that overlaps with child welfare is substance abuse. So parental substance abuse is a tremendous risk factor. There's a lot of overlap between substance abuse, chemical health, and parents' ability to care for their child safely. And so we're going to pause now, and I'm going to ask you to go to the link and watch this video, and then we'll come back and discuss this issue of substance abuse as well as several other issues related to the biological parents and working towards family reunification while a child is in foster care. So we'll pause now.